to A Push with Lennox, and it's fiesta time in San Antonio. We are going to party today in the Gilded Age. That's right, we're going to talk about Gilded Age politics. So let's get this party started. First things first, we got to get to that terminology, which I know you love, but there's a lot of it in the Gilded Age. Look at this, 3 columns. Now listen, the Gilded Age is typically seen as one of the more difficult time periods for AP US history students. And I think a lot of it has to do with the terminology. There are so many terms you need to know. I mean, just this list alone deals with politics. We haven't even talked about industrialization or the rise of monopolies or, the conquest of the West or any of that. So this is why I think it takes a little bit more time and a little bit more effort than some of the previous time periods, but it's totally worth it, because if you can nail the Gilded Age, you're going to be golden moving forward. All right. So as always, if there's a term or terms you don't know, go ahead and pause the video, make a list of those terms so you can look for them throughout this presentation. All right. Fantastic. Let's talk about the beginning of the Gilded Age. Now, my timeline usually goes, I'd say 1865, 1868, going through about 1890. That's what we consider the Gilded Age. It really started, I think, with Grant's administration. Grant's going to be elected following Johnson's presidency. Now, remember, Johnson took over for Lincoln, and he's going to serve the majority of Lincoln's term. So Grant's going to be elected in 1868 and will take office in 1869. He was a Republican, and he takes office during this social and political revolution in our country. 1870 is when the 15th Amendment is going to be ratified. And now with the African-American vote, you're going to see this Republican coalition being built down in the South, headed up primarily by these African-American voters. The problem with Grant is, while he was a fantastic military general, he was a horrible politician. His problem was he trusted too many people. He trusted his family, he trusted his friends, and he trusted that they would follow him the way his soldiers used to. Well, that just wasn't the case. So Grant's administration is going to be plagued by corruption. Now, you don't need to know every single corrupt policy or activity that took place. Just know a few of them, but be familiar with Grant being equated to corruption. Although none of this was ever directly tied to him. It was always his friends or his families and stuff like that. The big one is the Credit Mobilier scandal. That had to deal with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Union Pacific. A dummy corporation was set up called the Credit Mobilier. Stock was given to congressmen, and what they did was they used that company to filter money and basically take money off the top of the books. And they made a fortune off of it. Another one's going to be the whiskey ring. This is going to be where a private secretary of General Grant is going to help steal nearly $3 million in tax revenue from the federal government. Basically, they were collecting whiskey taxes, just not reporting everything they collected. When you see these different episodes of corruption, they got a nickname. It happens so often, they just started referring to them as Grantisms. Oh, more corruption? Just another Grantism? Let's move on. Okay? So make sure you understand that about Grant's presidency. Now, one thing I do want to point out, Grant might have been a horrible administrator, but he is the one president during the Gilded Age that actually did some work for civil rights. In fact, he was probably the most active civil rights president we had in the 1800s. So just keep that in mind. Don't dog on him too much. Corruption didn't just happen at the federal level, also occurred at local and state levels. Perfect example of this is going to be Tammany Hall in New York City. This was the Democratic political party machine, and they ran New York City like a machine. And their leader was William Boss Tweed. That's him up on the upper right. During Boss Tweed's tenure as the leader of Tammany Hall, he is going to successfully steal almost $200 million from the New York taxpayers. And how did he do it? He would sell government contracts. He would allow people to overcharge the government and then split the proceeds with him. And the way he kept his job was he also provided for immigrants in New York. You know, you need a job, go see Boss Tweed. You need some money, go see Boss Tweed. You need some clothes because you don't have any, go see Boss Tweed. And in response, all Boss Tweed asked for was your vote. And that's how he got his people in office. Now, he is going to be exposed, if you will, by Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is a very famous political cartoonist, and he is going to satirize Tweed throughout the newspapers at the time and basically bring attention to the corruption that was happening. Boss Tweed will end up going to jail, and he will die in jail, but not before he lives quite a good life on the back of the New York City taxpayers. The Panic of 1873 is going to give us pause. Things were going not great, but fairly well, but we're going to have an economic collapse in 73 that's going to take our focus off of Reconstruction and put it on the economy of our country. And the causes of this economic panic are no different than many of the other economic panics we have experienced and will experience. Overproduction. Overproduction in the industries, overproduction on the railroad, overproduction in the mines. Anytime you overproduce anything, meaning you have a surplus of it or a lot of it, that drives the price down. You only have one iPhone, you can sell it for whatever you want. But if you have 10 million iPhones, yeah, it's a little bit harder to get that top dollar. You have to lower the price. Same thing happened here. We just had too much of stuff, and that's going to lead to price dropping. And when the price drops, bankers are going to be in trouble, because guess who loaned all those companies the money to build all that stuff? The banks. So that's what we call, they over-speculated. They basically overestimated how much money these different industries were going to make. And so they loaned the money based on those projections. And when that didn't happen and these companies didn't have the money to pay them back, we started to see banks closing. Now, some banks tried to do the best they could with what they got, so they limited how they could get paid back. They wanted to get paid back with what we call hard currency or gold. See, paper doesn't really have any value if there's nothing to back it up. And that's what most of the debtors and honestly farmers used to pay their debt, was paper currency. Well, the bankers were like, no, we want hard currency. We want something that will hold its value. We're already losing money. We don't want to lose everything. So you're going to start to see this debate between hard currency and paper currency. And this is going to evolve throughout the Gilded Age. In fact, what we're going to see happening going into the 1880s is we're going to see the rise of the populist parties. And the farmers are going to push for maybe not greenbacks or paper dollar bills, but another form of currency in our government, and that's going to be the silver. So they're going to look for both a gold and silver standard for our economic situation. The election of 1876. Now, the election of 1876, it marks the official end of Reconstruction in our country. I know this is not a video about Reconstruction, but what you have to understand is you had Reconstruction and it kind of overlapped with the Gilded Age. So both of these things are happening at the same time. So when you look at timelines from 1865 to 1876, honestly, a lot of times you'll see a Gilded Age timeline and a Reconstruction timeline. Now, Reconstruction is going to come to an end because Hayes, in the Compromise of 1877, is going to promise to bring it to an end. You had conflicts. Several states from the South presented both Republican and Democratic electors for the Electoral College. Well, you can't have both sides vote. You only can only have one side vote. So Hayes, a Republican, made some promises to those southern states should they allow their Democratic electors to have a voice in the Electoral College. The first promise he made was to get rid of the federal troops down in the South. They had been in there since Congressional Reconstruction began. Remember, the military districts, all that. But he also sent some money down to the South. He sent funds down to the South so they could start building their transcontinental railroad. He also set up people in political jobs down in the South. That's that political patronage. And that was all part of this compromise to get him elected. But his election does mark the end of Reconstruction, okay? It also marks the beginning of this new idea called the New South. Henry Grady was a publisher who said that basically the southern states need to come into current times. They're stuck back in the 1850s and 60s. It's time they industrialize. And this New South will be a South, not just with agriculture, but with factories, with mines, with textile mills. Because let's face it, that was one of the major weaknesses that the Confederates had in the Civil War. They didn't have any manufacturing in the South. So Grady's like, we need to do that now. The problem is the South does not have a population to support manufacturing. In fact, after the Civil War, you see a lot of people leave the South. I mean, they lost everything, so they move elsewhere to look for a new life. Yeah, you have the African Americans, huge boost to population, but 1874 going on, a lot of them are broiled into sharecropping, what I call economic slavery, where they have agreed to farm for somebody in exchange. You know, they'll give them a percentage of their crop in exchange to be able to, you know, have their own farm. But the problem was it was set up where they could never get ahead. So they're stuck in this cycle of continually having to have debt and continually stuck in sharecropping. They're not going to be able to go out and get jobs in factories. And then you also had people moving west. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, still in play. And so you had a lot of people going west looking for new lands, new lives, all that other stuff. Because of all this New South just didn't prosper. And what we're going to see happen is income in the South is generally about, on average, 40% lower than the national average. So poverty was a very big problem in the South during this time. Supreme Court, never quiet. During the 1875, you had the Civil Rights Act passed. Now, this is during the latter half of Grant's second term. And he's going to sign this into law, and it made it a crime to deny equal access to public spaces because of race. Well, that means that you can't segregate a public library. You can't segregate parks or any place else for that matter. Well, in 1883, that law is going to be challenged in the civil rights cases of 1883, and they're going to strike down the Civil Rights Act of 75. They're basically going to say this: yeah, we have the 14th Amendment that promises everybody, you know, equal protection under the law. But the 14th Amendment actually just applies to the federal government. It doesn't necessarily apply to local governments. And because of that, individuals can discriminate. We can't stop that from happening. And so what that's going to do is that's going to elevate this idea of Jim Crow laws starting to expand through the South, because local governments and to a point state governments are going to say, hey, we're not breaking the federal law because the federal law doesn't apply in this circumstance. The 14th Amendment doesn't apply here. And, you know, the 15th Amendment, I'll talk about that in a minute, while it gives African-American males the right to vote, they have the right to vote, but we've also implemented some of our own rules. And this movement of Jim Crow is going to be solidified in 1896 with the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, where the Supreme Court said that separate but equal is okay. And so segregation is just going to explode from that. Jim Crow laws, what I'm talking about, when it came to the vote, you know, state lawmakers, local lawmakers did everything they could to keep the African American from voting. Because remember, you had that Republican coalition. But with the end of Reconstruction, there's this move to get Southern Democrat governments back in place. So they're going to institute things like literacy tests, poll taxes, property requirements, and grandfather clauses, all to prohibit the African American men from voting. You can't read and write, you can't vote. Oh, you don't have money to pay the tax? You can't vote. You don't own property? Well, you can't vote. Oh, your grandfather didn't vote in the election of 1860? You can't vote. That's the kind of way it worked. And so Jim Crow is going to become the way of life in the South and kind of moving a little bit into the North in some areas, you know, until about 1954, honestly. I mean, yeah, some things change. You're going to have like, you know, executive orders that are going to desegregate the military. You're going to have executive orders that are going to, you know, prevent federal defense contractors from, you know, discriminating on their hiring based on race and everything. But segregation is going to be part of our country until it's not. And that's going to be, and actually it's going to go on into the 60s. But 1954, Brown v. Board of Education basically said, you know what? Separate but equal ain't equal. So they threw that out. But it's going to be a while to get there. Because of all this, because of the Jim Crow laws, because of the voting laws, everything like that, we're going to see what we call redeemer governments come into play in the southern states. That means that we are redeeming or bringing back those southern leadership that was in place prior to the Civil War. Now, it might not be the exact same people, but the ideas still remain. Okay, so you're going to see that Democratic bloc and what we call the Solid South in 80, 84, 88, and 92. Okay. Outside of our country, we've had a lot of immigrants come in primarily to help build our transcontinental railroad. The big group is going to be the Chinese. They're going to be coming over here to help with our transcontinental railroad. They're going to be coming over here to help in our mines and everything like that. And they'll work for less than most American workers. So that's going to be seen as a threat to American working men. And so you're going to see this rise of nativism, this idea of, America, we need to hire Americans first. We need American companies first, all this other stuff. And immigrants are a threat to the American way of life. And because of that, the Chinese Exclusion Act is going to be passed in 1882, which is going to prohibit any Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States. Now, we've had immigration laws on the books since 1791 when George Washington took office. We've never had immigration laws based on race and nationality. This will be the first law based on those two ideas when we eliminate any Chinese from coming to America. When we get to, was it 1904, 1906, I believe, you're also going to have the gentleman's agreement with Japan, where they agreed to work with us to prevent any Japanese from immigrating to the United States. The big idea about politics during the Gilded Age, ingrain this in your head, is laissez faire, hands off, keep the government out of the economy. And that's what's going to happen here. The government has nothing to do with the economy at this point. When the Panic of 1873 hit, they just let it go. Let the economy grow on its own. When the Panic of 1893 will hit, they just let it go. Let the economy recover on its own, because they don't think it's the government's role to control our economy. This is really the last time in our history that we see a full laissez-faire policy. We'll see a little bit coming into the 1920s after World War I. People like Calvin Coolidge is going to go back to this idea of less government involvement. But once we hit the 1930s, the Great Depression, the New Deal, there's no turning back. Our government now controls every part of the economy it possibly can, to the point now where we look to the government to fix our economy, regardless of what's going on. We see that as their responsibility. But there were some effects of laissez-faire because of this hands-off policy and everything like that, attitude towards government. A lot of political patronage is going to take place during the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Now, it's going to come to an end in the 1880s with the passage of the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act is going to be what we call civil service reform, which is going to require you to pass an exam if you want to work for the government. But you still have people in both parties, because it wasn't just, patronage was not just limited to one political party. Both were guilty. And so in both parties, you had groups of people who supported civil service reform. That's what we called the half-breeds. But then you also had groups who supported patronage. Leave it the way it is. Those are the stalwarts. So you had these different ideologies coming at each other within the different ideologies of the political parties. So it was getting a little, challenging at the time. But on the other hand, during the 1880s, we also have huge treasury reserves, because the government, while not involved with the economy, was very good at imposing tariffs on imports and stuff like that. So we see a huge surplus of funds in our treasury in the 1880s. That's not going to last long because the Panic of 93 is coming, but we'll enjoy it while we can. Okay. All right. That's it for this one. My next video, I'm going to talk about industry in the Gilded Age. We'll talk about the monopolists. We'll talk about unions, and we'll see how they interact with one another. But for everything else, listen, this is also known as the time period of the forgotten presidents. And I also did another video, and I'll put a link right here at the end to that video, because during the Gilded Age, with the exception of Grant, no other president for a 30-year period served 2 consecutive terms. Every president was only in there for 1 term, with the exception of Grover Cleveland. However, his 2 terms were not consecutive. Benji Harrison was president in between his 2 terms. So I'll link up the forgotten presidents to you. Other than that, I hope you have a great day. Thanks for listening. See you next time.